was really, really.
But I don't get a good view of the sunrise. Our backyard faces west towards you. So we only
Gotcha.
get good sunsets.
Yeah, well, we had we had some inclement weather in our area. Harvey, what's the weather like there in the Portland, Vancouver area?
Well, it's warmed up to 40.
Uh,
We were snowed in for a week.
you were snowed in?
We were snowed in.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Did you tell me that? I didn't see that in any texts or emails that you were actually snowed
A
in.
week ago, Saturday, we had a heavy snow. Then on Monday, we had an ice storm. And where we live, we don't get a lot of road clearing. We only got 2 roads cleared, but our road wasn't. So we were housebound for about 6 days. And then we were able to sneak out.
The kids were tobogganing.
Kids were tobogganing. We live on a flat, but there's a hill. So they shut down, the parents shut down the street so they can go tobogganing down the hill.
Did you know you were going to be housebound though?
No,
Oh,
we didn't know it was going to be that bad because we've had snow before, but it melted. The snow just melted 2 days ago.
so were you prepared for this or not?
We're Jewish. We always have enough food.
Well, good. I'm glad you had the food covered.
I
But-
love it.
No, we did not have a snow shovel that we borrowed our neighbors. So I have now purchased one, which will guarantee we'll never have any more snow.
Good. Well, I hope it makes for fun and nothing. You got to take care of Sharon, man. We can't have
Oh,
her.
she's
Can't have
good
her
now.
taking
Yep.
falls.
She's pretty well back to
What?
normal.
I know. You got to be careful. Everybody does.
Oh, yeah.
In the best of situations.
That's why we didn't go out.
Yeah, that's why another reason we didn't go out, not even for a walk.
Yeah. I hear
But
you.
today, I think I don't know, what is the weather right now?
He was out shoveling snow in the first Sunday we had. Beautiful sun, and it was 20 degrees out, and he wasn't cold at all. So it's interesting.
Now we got 47 degrees right now, and it's gonna go down.
Not very far.
Not very far today. It's warmed up.
Well, I'm glad everybody made it on, and Texas is doing okay, guys. Schulman?
We are doing great. We also had super frigid weather. We were dripping faucets throughout the entire house for 3 days straight. Still ended up with one toilet freezing up, but everything thawed beautifully and without incident. So
Good.
we're also pleased that the cold weather is gone.
Good. Well, I was down in San
Good
Diego
to
just
see
for.
you.
Thank you. I was down in San Diego on Monday for just a half a day or so, and it was pouring down there. I mean, they had like floods, and I've never seen like a city less prepared for the rain because I mean, I know they had a crazy amount of rain, but I've never seen anything like this. I mean, like street upon street major streets were flooded over. And it was like really dangerous. It was beyond dangerous. I mean, I think they've had an SUV, so I was driving through some of the terrain okay, but I can't imagine cars having to drive through this. And I guess some of the school districts closed down, but my daughters didn't. And there were way too many people on the road for that kind of weather or that kind of inability to handle the weather, I should say. So. Well, I'm glad everyone is safe, and thank you everybody for being here online. And we got about 10 computers. We got about another half a dozen people on as well. So it's probably about 15 people on for our Pirke Avot today. The last couple of sessions we've had, the one right before I was out for the break, and then last week, we've been going through the first chapter of Pirke Avot. Pirke Avot is about 6 chapters, but the first chapter that we're in, which is the early, and it follows chronologically, or so far it's followed chronologically through the rabbis. We've had, a rabbi give a saying, and his contemporary, his main colleague, giving a saying. So over the last couple of weeks, we've we've looked at these, this going through this first chapter, and it's definitely organized in a way that generally follows a chronological order, but it's not exact. But these rabbis that are quoted thus far are all living between 200 BCE to 200 of the Common Era. But what we read this last week was the last week when we read with Hillel and Shammai, that two of the most famous rabbis in that period, and two of the most famous rabbis of all time, definitely from the standpoint of rabbis that would debate against each other and kind of held different courts, if you will, at the same time. They definitely are the most famous rivals. And they're early in the period. They're about 40 BCE. So they're about, as we said, about the time of Julius Caesar, the time of King Herod. Augustus
Go
Caesar.
back to where you were.
That's where these guys
Hold
are.
on, leave this alone.
You have to have the
Wait.
iPad.
So that's where we are with chronologically where we are. But we got introduced to Rabbi Hillel last week again, and we mentioned that he's the more famous, the more taught rabbi of the pair. Obviously, we talked about all the different things that are named after Hillel, including the college campuses, the Hillels, the synagogues that are Temple Beth Hillel, the many places where we find Hillel's name and legacy preserved. And we said, there's not a lot of Shammai. There's not a lot of people named after Shammai. There's not a lot of Shammai around. But what's also important about Hillel is that his descendants became a dynasty. His descendants become the lineage of rabbis who are the ones in power. And what we have now is a digression away from Hillel. In this end of this chapter 1, we have a digression from the chronology to Hillel's family, and not all of them, but some of the most famous ones that are part of his family. So I was trying to find a really good genealogy of the Hillel dynasty, and I really didn't find a clear one. But when we go through Hillel's family, we have Rabban Gamliel, the rabbi we're about to read, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who sometimes goes by the acronym of Rashbag, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. And then, as we mentioned, there are a few Gamliels. And then we finally get to Judah Hanasi, who's the guy who actually is responsible for organizing and editing the Mishnah. And he lives about 200 of the Common Era. He is the last of the Tanaim. He's the last of the rabbis who are quoted in the Mishnah. So the rabbis that are quoted later on and the rest of the Talmud and what we call the Gemara, those are all rabbis that live from about 200 to about 500. And to put it into perspective of what's going on in the world, that's during the Byzantine period. It's a time when the Greek Christian-based Romans, they were still Romans, that were based in Istanbul and Constantinople at the time. They were the ones who controlled Israel, and they are the ones who the rabbis are now dealing with anti-Semitism and church-sanctioned anti-Semitism that comes out of the Eastern Roman area. When it becomes Christian during the time of Constantine and after, that's when things get really, really difficult. During the Roman period, things were difficult politically, but then during the Byzantine period, things get challenging from the religious side, where the rabbis and the Jewish community and in the land of Israel now is dealing not just with Romans, but now with Christian Romans or Christian Greco-Roman period people, the Byzantines, who sometimes make life very hard and enact laws that make Judaism difficult. So the rabbis during this period start, they talk a little bit about it. There's some reflections of that in the Talmud, but they're very, for the most part, very quiet about it and try not to agitate the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire comes to an end in the land of Israel when the Arabs, the Muslim Arabs, come in and destroy the Byzantine Empire, and that's the end of Christian control of the land of Israel until the 100-year period or so of the Crusades, a few hundred years after that. So these guys that we're reading now about are in that period from about 100, Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Judah Hanasi. They're at the time of the Roman period still, not Christian yet, good old Romans. For people who want to put on their film caps or used films to help them place themselves, this is around the time of Gladiator. This is during the time roughly of Marcus Aurelius, who was played by Richard Harris in that movie. One of his last roles as a Roman emperor during that period. That puts you where we are now. Is that period of Shammai, of Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabban Gamliel, Shimon ben Gamliel, and then Judah Hanasi. So let's look at these guys. These are all Hillel's families. These are all Hillel's descendants. And then this is what we got. So here we are. Rabban Gamliel used to say, appoint for yourself a teacher, avoid doubt, and do not make a habit of tithing by guesswork. So again, Shammai's last thing, Hillel and Shammai, and then we get into Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Hillel's grandson. So his is a threefold saying, like a lot of the sayings we've had. Get yourself a teacher, Oselecha Rav, which is, get a teacher, which we've had already some similar sayings like this. But this is where it gets different from, the previous one we had read where it says get a teacher, find yourself a colleague, a chaver. Talked about that one last week. This one, though, moves into a couple of things that are interesting, which are avoid doubt, which is kind of a strange phrase because, doubt is a natural kind of situation to be in, but what they're really talking about here are legal situations where you're not really sure what to do, where it's kind of we're not really clear. And so he's kind of saying, as a rabbi, as a teacher, and as an adjudicator, try to avoid situations like that. Don't look for situations like that. And you could make the argument it's partly because they're going to happen as they are. Don't look for them. Don't try to search them out. So by avoiding them, they'll find you, but don't search them out. Don't try to continuously put yourself in a situation where you're having to make difficult decisions and where you have a lot of doubt over what the answer is. If there's a clear answer, if there's a clear law on something, it's not really left to doubt. We don't really have to say, well, we really don't know what to do. He's saying, don't do that. And the last thing that he's talking about, which is again, where he says aser, to do the tithing, he's basically saying, again, it's similar to not being sure of something. When you're giving your special part of your crops that are designed and meant to go, obligated, responsible to go to the temple, don't guess about it. Don't say, well, kind of think this is what it is. Make sure you do it right. Make sure you tithe properly. Make sure you don't guess. Make sure you don't leave it to chance and don't leave it to an estimate. Really know. And that, of course, is important for people who have farms and who have produce that needs to be tithed. If you don't have to tithe, you'd say, well, but it also goes for any type of, you could argue, religious or when you're responsible for giving, don't leave it to guesswork. Try to really know what it is. And I guess, the modern equivalent is if you're saying, look, I'm giving 10% of my income to charity, make sure you really do. If you're going to say you're going to do it, it's not the same as a tithe, but similar. It's same kind of idea in that you're putting something aside for a higher purpose. Make sure you don't guess. So the next one is a interesting text because now it goes to, again, Rabban Gamliel's son, Shimon, who's known as Shimon ben Gamliel. The next one is also Shimon ben Gamliel, but it's a little confusing because there were two Gamliels. There actually were three Gamliels, and some of the Gamliels also had sons called Shimon. So it's not clear that it's the same one. It probably, because it says Shimon ben Gamliel, that it could be one of the next generations. And you'll see why. We really don't know, but we know when Rabban Gamliel lived, roughly. We know when the first Shimon ben Gamliel lived, but if it's the second Shimon ben Gamliel, then it would have been maybe 50 years after that too. But you'll see, we know there's a terminus point. We know there's a place where all this ends. But here's what Shimon said. And it says right away, Shimon, his son, said, he used to say, all my days I grew up among the sages, and I have found nothing better for a person than silence. Study is not the most important thing, but actions. Whoever indulges in too many words brings about sin. Now, this is definitely a multi-part saying, so it's a few different ideas, but they're all connected to the same kind of principle, which is what Shammai said. Again, Shammai was the adversary of his great-great-grandfather Hillel, but remember, Shammai said, speak little and do much. He's essentially kind of saying the same thing.
Yes.
Do things. Do things. And that's the translation of this word ma'aseh, to do things. And
Also something very important here.
yeah,
When you're always talking, you can't listen. In the silence, you can listen and learn and let stuff in.
yeah. We've talked about this here. We've talked about it with other places. I've talked about it with other people. You have to be able to listen. And again,
Yes.
as a therapist, that's really the only way you can do your job.
Yes.
So yeah, he lays it out. The first place, it's nothing better than silence, right? Well, that's very general thing, but he doesn't leave it at that, because the next line, the study is not the most important thing, but actions, is interesting because it's not that study is all about talking, but there's a little bit of talking that goes on. But the bottom line is he's saying is it's not really, and he's a student and a teacher, but he's saying it's really about actions. But then that leads to the third thing, which goes back to the talking, which is somebody who's talking too much is helping to bring about sin. They're bringing about transgression by talking too much. So there's this concept throughout these three sayings, which are focus on what you're doing, focus not so much on what you're saying or what you're teaching, but what are you doing, and making sure that you're listening. Even though he doesn't say, make sure you listen, he as I think Joyce just said, it's the only way you can really learn about what you need to do is by listening. So definitely cautionary, said in a cautionary way, like a lot of these, bringing about sin. He's actually telling you what'll happen if you don't do this. So, this is another factor that we sometimes see in these, which is that, sometimes it'll actually say there's a bad thing that'll happen, and this is the bad thing that'll happen. In this case, it says sin. You'll see it sometimes there'll be a different caution, but we see that sometimes too, is there'll be and if you don't, you're going to get this. Sometimes they'll just say, this is what you should do, or this is what you shouldn't do. But sometimes they'll actually say, otherwise it's going to bring about some bad stuff. So that is his. Now, the next one, again, from Shimon ben Gamliel, this is the last one of the chapter, but again, not really sure why it has to be the end of the chapter, because the next one is also part of the same family, but this is the way it was divided. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel used to say, and there's no difference between rabbi and Rabban. Rabban is a title. but nobody who, I mean, Rabban is, I guess, is a higher title. Not everyone who's a rabbi is a Rabban, but not everybody who was a Rabban is referred to as Rabban either. I mean, it's definitely a title that was there, but not a lot of people are called it. And sometimes, again, people who could have been called it aren't really called it. So it's definitely an honorific title, but it's not, he's a rabbi. He just was one of the head rabbis, but not everyone who was a head rabbi was also called Rabban. But Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel used to say, on three things does the world stand: on justice, on truth, and on peace. Sounds a lot like truth, justice, and the American way. I don't know, maybe that's where it came from. As it is said, execute the judgment of truth and peace in your gates, which is a quote from Zechariah, the prophet. But it's another threefold, right? Which we see a lot. And it's another one that goes back to one of the first ones we read, which was another rabbi wrote many, many generations ago, just to take a look at it. Rabbi Shimon, right? At the very beginning, Shimon HaTzadik said, Al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed. On three things the world stands. This one's more famous, Al HaTorah, Al HaAvodah, Ve'al Gemilut Chasadim. We sing that song. Well, listen, that's the first saying, right? That's the first of the rabbinic sayings. But this one is also, again, has that same phrase, which is the world stands. It's the same thing. Al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed. So that phrase, on three things the world stood or stands, I guess always stands, I should really say. That phrase is the same exact phrase in Hebrew. It's the same words. Al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed. Now, that means that rabbis were known for saying certain things, right? They were be quoted, right? And so this idea that somebody would, would have be essentially be known for something, right? They would be known for, for a famous saying. There's a very famous version of this that I'll share with you so you can see it with your own eyes. It's very famous part of the Christian Bible. And what's interesting about it is there's versions of it in all three of the Christian Gospels that we call the synoptic Gospels, the Gospels that tell the story of the life of Jesus. Basically not John. John doesn't follow a linear story about Jesus. So the three that do, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have a version of this. So the one in Mark is really the longest one. But this one, you've put it different ways. But the point is that like the three Gospels don't always say the same thing. I mean, they have different takes on what happened with Jesus, but they all have this story, and this is the famous version of it, or this is the famous story that even Christians have heard. So it says one of the scribes came and heard them debating, and again, the word for scribe would have been either sophrim or prushim, or the rabbis. But the people that we're talking about here, it's the same, around the same time as Rabbi Hillel. They heard the debating. Noticing that Jesus had given him a good answer, he asked, of all the commandments, which is the most important? Now, that's one version of it. Another one is, on one occasion, an expert in the law, which is essentially the same thing as a scribe or a rabbi, stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, which would be Rav, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Well, it's a little different, but it's a similar kind of idea. And then here's another one. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. So there's all kind of agreement that these are scribes, proto-rabbis, rabbis that come to him. The Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert of the law, tested him with the question, teacher, which is the greatest commandment of the law? Now, by the way, calling him teacher here is probably, and again, same thing here with calling him teacher or Rav. If they called him Rav, they might have meant it sarcastically, because it seems like they're testing him. It seems like they want to see what he'll say, because they want to see if he's really teaching the Torah. So here's what he says. Here's what Jesus says. The most important one, answered Jesus. Actually, well, I'll read the Mark one. I started. They're similar, so I'm not going to read all three. The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. I don't like the way it's given in this one, but I started it, so let me finish it. The most important one, answered Jesus, is this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, or with all your strength. The second is this. Love your neighbor as yourself. There is no greater commandment than these. I don't like that translation, and I don't like that phrasing of it, because he says first, this is the most important one, and then this is the second most important one, and there's no more important one than these. I don't love that phrasing. It's a little awkward, because in the other ones are, especially the one in Matthew, which is to some extent the most Jewish one, Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments, which is interesting because it is kind of the most Jewish sounding version of it. And Matthew is the most Jewish of the gospel writers. He's the most knowledgeably Jewish writer of the three gospel writers. But you can see what he did. Jesus took the Torah and answered with the Torah. He took those questions. What's the most important law? And he answered it. Now, of course, it's interesting because he doesn't answer with one, he answers with two. But what he said was even more powerful when you think about it in Hebrew, because what Jesus said to these people was, Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, right? Love God. And he said, Ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. Ve'ahavta and ve'ahavta. And my guess is that anybody who lived in those times, and anybody who would have said something similar, which could have been other rabbis too, said the words ve'ahavta, ve'ahavta. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. It's a play on the word ve'ahavta. Love God and love other people. It's very, very similar to what we're reading now. It's very similar to what we read in Pirke Avot, but it's also interesting in that people seem to be trying to formulate these sayings that people will remember them by. And that's, to me, what's interesting about this is that at least here in the Gospels, they're trying to give Jesus the role of being a teacher, of being a rabbi, and putting in his mouth the same kinds of things that the rabbis were saying, the same kinds of things that were happening in Pirke Avot, that Jesus would be known for those kinds of sayings. So it's a very similar thing, except again, in Hebrew, it's even more obvious because it's the same word both times. Love and then love. Right? And so this is what we see in Pirke Avot throughout Pirke Avot, is the rabbis quoting Torah in some cases very obviously, maybe less obviously than what Jesus just did, which is directly quote the Torah, but still come up with these formulations of saying, this is the most important thing. The world rests on these things, or the whole Torah can be summarized like this. And we talked about the similarity of what happened with Rabbi Hillel, where Rabbi Hillel is questioned by a convert, what's the most important law? And he says, Ve'ahavta. Well, he actually says, what is hateful to you, don't do unto others. A version of Ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, love your neighbors yourself. He formulated it in the negative, and then he says, the rest of the Torah is for you to study, which is why some people say that Jesus his teacher was Hillel, because we know that Hillel lived before Jesus. So this is what the rabbis do all the time. And this is what the people still are kind of asking. That's where we are. Let me just show you this one last thing. here, which is one of my favorite quotes. I'm going to pop it up here for you to see. Here's the famous line that a lot of people have heard. Hopefully you've heard. Abraham Lincoln. Oh, just got rid of that. Let's just put it up from Amazon, but let me get that up there. What he said was, I have never united myself to any church because I have found difficulty in giving my assent without mental reservation to the long, complicated statements of Christian doctrine, which characterize their articles of belief and confessions of faith. When any church will inscribe over its altar as the sole qualification for membership, the Savior condensed statement of the substance of both law and gospel, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, and love thy neighbor as thyself, that church I will join with all my heart. Pretty powerful, right? So Lincoln knew what he was quoting at the time. And, he basically said he hadn't found a church that lived by that. Which is interesting because, again, some people have speculated that Lincoln was Jewish because he wasn't a member of a church. But based on that quote, he's basically just saying, hey, look, I haven't found a church that actually lives by the words of Jesus. But the words of Jesus are, as you're seeing right now, are remarkably close to some of these things that we find in Pirke Avot and in the Talmud, which shouldn't surprise us because it was written around the same time. And again, in some cases, predates it. That doesn't make the fact that Jesus says it any less important. I'm just saying that a type of approach was floating around at the time. Okay. So now we go another generation forward, all in the Hillel family, and this is Rabbi Judah Hanasi, who's referred to oftentimes just as Rabbi. He was so big that they just called him Rabbi. And this is Judah Hanasi, who lives around 200. Rabbi said, which is the straight path that a man should choose for himself? As you can see, this is a long one. One which is an honor to the person adopting it, and on account of which honor accrues to him for others. Be careful with a light commandment as with a grave one, for you do not know the reward for the fulfillment of the commandments. Also, reckon the loss that may be sustained through the fulfillment of a commandment against the reward accruing thereby, and the gain that may be obtained through the committing of a transgression against the loss entailed thereby. Apply your mind to three things, and you will not come into the clutches of sin. Know what there is above you, an eye that sees, an ear that hears, and your deeds are written in a book. So people remember the last part of it because it's another one of those threefold sayings. It's a great threefold saying. It's one that we think about a lot at high holidays. If anyone ever wonders, like, where does this kind of idea of a book of life come from? Where do we start to see it early? We see it here, pretty clearly here, that there's a book where our deeds are written. So this is 200. This is 1,800 years ago. Jewish people were already envisioning that there's a book. But of course, even if it doesn't make its way into the book, there's an eye that saw it. There's an ear that heard it. We understand, again, not necessarily that God has eyes and ears and a book, but the idea that there's an accountability, that there's an idea that there is a bigger effect that our actions have and that there's consequences to that is something that's really important in Judaism. And whether we believe that is that if there's recompense for that by God, people can argue about that. What's interesting about it is that Rabbi Judah Hanasi, Rabbi here, says, we don't know. We don't know. We don't know the reward for the fulfillment of mitzvot. We don't really know for sure what can happen to us when we sin. But we better be careful with it. We better be careful because when we do certain things, we better think about what the consequences could be. What are the he calls them the rewards. I'm not even sure that's the best translation of that. Let me just check real quick. Yeah, I think reward or payment, recompense could be also a word. Yeah. So thinking about what the consequences of our actions are is important. But he also says, look, we don't know. We don't know what they are. So we can never go around telling people, well, this is the most important commandment for you to do. You know, it's most important for you to keep kosher, because if you keep kosher, everything else is going to be fine in your life. He basically says you can't say that. We don't know. God never said, if you follow this commandment, then you don't have to follow the other ones, or the other ones are less important. We don't know. So when we get to this kind of final line, which is, again, one about really thinking about our actions, it reminds us that not only are we never sure, you know, which mitzvah we did is the most important one. It's not like we know whether they all get counted, you know, the same way, or how they're counted, or what they mean. We do know that our actions, though, have a consequence, and they are noted. For a long time, people thought, and probably questioned and doubted, whether that was true, right? People would say, I don't really know that there's a God who cares about everything I do. Is that God that even if I believe God created the universe, do I really believe that there's a God who actually knows what I did or cares about what I did? Right? So people would say to themselves, yeah, either there is no God, there is no accounting for this stuff anyways, or even if there is, God has got much bigger problems than whether I do something like. And so for a long time, I think up until maybe the last couple of years, people kind of said, it's a matter of faith. Now, of course, most people couldn't openly question that, because almost every community had some observance of Judaism, Christianity, Islam. There was some authority, religious authority, that was over people. So it's not like people were just running around going, there's no God, it doesn't matter. That's more of a modern 20th century creation. But I'm sure people always questioned it. And I mean, it seems to be needs to be said here too. Now, here's the thing. There's no doubt that this last part of it is actually true now. We used to think that this was, again, a matter of faith. I can tell you that we're getting to a point in time in human history where this is an absolute fact. The difference is that it's not God that's keeping an account of this. Do you understand? It's not God anymore. You know what I'm saying, right? What am I saying? I mean, what am I saying? Who's taking account of this? Anybody?
Government.
Yeah. Government. Anybody who has access to the millions of cameras that are watching us at any given time.
Google.
Yep.
Google.
Yep. There is no end to the amount of information that we're creating now on ourselves that's now being recorded. I assume that every call that I make on my phone is being recorded. I assume that every search that I make on the internet is being recorded somewhere.
Well, if that's the case, then hell really is the end of us.
Well, it's a question, John, it's an interesting question, right? Just to give you an example. If we don't believe in a higher power that cares about us doing certain things, and I say to myself, well, you know, what I did is I spent the last 2 hours, I don't even want to throw out some of the terms that could be used, but if I spent the last 2 hours, you know, searching porn on my computer, I could say, well, it's not anybody's business. I used a private browser. I used I didn't use Google. I didn't, whatever you did. But if in reality, somewhere that those keystrokes are logged, you go, well, look, I don't know whether God cares about whether I did a search on porn, but the the community that I live with, my spouse, my friends, if somebody decides to blackmail me, I'm going to I'm worried about it. Look, I mean, every one of us has gotten an email from some spam, person saying, I have videos of you and I will release them if I don't get, X amount of cryptocurrency. Now, the fact that most of us laugh at that and go, that's insane. Just remember, there are always people that are responding to that. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. Let me just tell you this. I've had numerous calls. I don't get them as much anymore because people have gotten desensitized to it and they expect it now. But when it first started happening, I got calls from people who were worried and reached out to me to say that they were worried that they were going to have their lives ruined by stuff they had done because they had gotten an email like that. Now, look, the reason that they were freaking out was because they had stuff on their computer that they didn't want people to know. I've shown people on my own, showed people recently stuff on my own phone where someone was trying to blackmail me because they had my phone. I had my phone stolen a little over a month ago, and people tried to blackmail me I didn't care because I don't have anything on my phone that I'm worried about. But if I was, maybe I would have been scared. Not only that.
Speaking of that, Rabbi, have you heard from the
No,
Premier?
I've not heard from China. I have had no more contact from China in the last 2 weeks, but they had my phone. They actually had my phone. So I was like, well, this isn't just a matter of getting some email from somebody saying that they've hacked my computer but this was actually somebody had my phone. So, I don't know what to tell you other than all of this points to the fact that, and all of us have to assume that it's not going to get, we're only going to get further down the road of having our information recorded. The trade-offs for it, of course, is that people feel more secure. The whole reason why a lot of and this, most of you know this, the reason that we essentially allowed this information to be pulled from us is because of 9/11 and because the Patriot Act opened up the United States government to create huge databases of everything that we ever do online, every conversation that we have. So we did this for our own security. That was the trade-off. They've talked about, the fact that eventually every child that's born is going to get chipped when they're born for safety reasons. The reason it'll be done is so that our children will never get kidnapped. But the trade-off is that someone will always know where that child and then eventually that person always is. Will people eventually have the chip removed? I don't know. Maybe, but maybe people will say, you know what? That way my husband or wife can never get kidnapped. Look, some of it we'll agree to have our freedoms and our ability to not be watched all the time. We'll give it up because we'll get an economic benefit from it or because we'll get a safety benefit from it. But the reality is that it's not going to get easier to be off of the grid or to be untrackable. It's going to get harder and harder as almost every moment will be recorded. Right. So when we all have our Apple visors, when that price comes down and we all have our Apple visor, what that'll do is eventually record everything that we look at. Right. That Apple visor will record everything that we see. We'll want that because you know how we take video now and take pictures? What if we can replay every moment that we want at any given time, at any given moment? I never have to press my camera. I never have to record anything on a video, on a video camera. Everything's being videotaped for me. I can go back and relive that moment or see that moment. I remember that happened at about 12 o'clock. All I have to do is look over to the side and know to mark that. Well, everybody wants that. I mean, they'll say they want it. I want to be able to record everything that I looked at on that trip. People will say, now I have it. I didn't even have to think about it. It was all done for me. I zoom in when I want. I mean, the Apple visor can do that. And how many people are going to say, you know what? I want my kids and my grandkids and my family to be able to see everything I do, so that when I'm gone from this world, people will actually know what I did and what I saw. They'll know the trips that I went on. They'll know the people that I saw. They'll know the concerts that I went to. And you'll say to yourself, well, that's a kind of an immortality. I'll be able to have people know what I did and what I saw. And people will agree to that because it's another way for them to, again, have a legacy. Well, what they're going to, what
Hey, Rabbi,
we'll all have agreed to do is know that there's an eye that sees, an ear that hears, and deeds that are written down in X's and ones and O's and bits and bytes.
hey, Rabbi,
Yeah.
that dovetails into that second to last line where it says the clutches of sin. So those of us that people that may wear that type of technology from birth, if you will, they may think twice before they do something. So it could be not just a burden, but it could be a benefit for society. So it's interesting how you can play that out.
Yep. And will that inform the decisions that they make, knowing that people can know what they're doing? We're only starting to see the beginning of this. We're only at the beginning of this journey of getting to this, but we've opened it up. I mean, we know that it's there. So, my guess is that some people will opt in for this kind of technology and some people will opt out, but it'll be very hard for people to opt out. And the consequences will be, again, living essentially a whole different existence. And so as we get to that point, we're gonna see some interesting stuff, but we're actually creating this. We're actually creating this situation that, for better or worse, we're going to have to deal with it with the consequences. But as John has said, and again, what I think this is kind of getting us to, maybe when people know that their actions and the things that they start pursuing are going to that they'll have a consequence. It's an interesting question. And so is there a possibility that people eventually kind of, if their behavior is affected by this, but is it affected because it's a deity, because it's God, or because it's the technology? But does it really matter if in the end, is it leading people to understand that their actions are essentially being watched and being judged? I mean, look, this can scare somebody, right? This can be frightening, and you wonder like how many kids have been traumatized by learning this. I don't remember how old I was when I learned this, but it has an effect on you knowing that is at least possible. It's at least possible that if God knows everything, God knows what I do, at every given time, that there's actually, it's actually being monitored. It's actually being watched. There actually is something. There is some record of it.
Isn't that Albert Brooks?
Now,
Isn't
What?
that an Albert? Isn't that
even
an
now,
Albert?
Rabbi, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Joyce?
Yes, I was going to say, even now there's a variation of how we adopt these type technologies. Look at Facebook. There are some people who put everything they do on Facebook. This is my breakfast. This is my
Yeah.
lunch. And they take pictures of themselves everywhere they go. And
Yep.
there are people that look at it once a week.
Yep. Yeah. And there's,
So
and
there's still a wide variation of people adopting these technologies and recording everything they see and do.
yeah, but people, the fact that people willingly do that indicates to me that I don't know that, I don't know that there's any looking back. Again, will we get to a point where people are forced into it, or whether they,
Ah,
whether they
that's
have a
the
choice to opt out of it? I don't know, but that we might be getting to a point where that could essentially be the dividing factor between society. No longer, wealthy and poor, no longer, of developed countries or less developed countries, whatever, but that there will be people whose information is constantly being monitored, and or people who are opting out of it. And to opt out of it might mean literally to have no technology. So it's possible.
Hey, Rabbi, do you
Yeah,
remember?
John is talking about one of my favorite movies, Defending Your Life, which is
Oh, wonderful.
it's a great meditation on life and death, which is a very Jewish movie. It's one of Albert Brooks's kind of essays on life, and he was very informed in that movie by his Jewish identity, because that's essentially the Jewish view of what happens to us after we go. But he did it in a really in a comical way, but a powerful way, but also in a way that I think was actually, one of the first modern versions of like what heaven would look like to a modern human. By the way, there's a new documentary that just came out that Albert Brooks and well, actually Rob Reiner directed it, but it's a documentary about him, and they've been friends since they were in high school. They went to high school together. That Albert, it's called Defending My Life, and it's about his life, looking back on his life and his career and his decisions. But Defending Your Life is a great movie because it gets to this issue of like, how does our tradition, or how can a tradition view the afterlife? And I think it's a really compelling way. But the idea that there is a prosecuting attorney and a defense attorney in the movie, Rip Torn plays his defense attorney, which is really funny because Rip Torn is phenomenal as his defense attorney. And Claire Bloom plays the advocate against him. We could actually call that in Hebrew Satan. That's the prosecuting attorney. So in Judaism, Satan isn't really the devil. He is just the person who, when you die, or the entity when you die, that is the prosecuting attorney and gives God all the bad file on you. And so that's what she does in that movie. And so Albert Brooks has to essentially, make an accounting for his life. And it's a really good meditation on what's important in life, and like how we can look at life in a way that I hope is somewhat like the way it really is. But yeah, it's a very thought-provoking movie, and I think it's funny, but it's also, I think it's really thought-provoking.
But Rabbi, for those of the people that hadn't seen it, and if there's anybody that hasn't seen it, my point was that they pull back video,
Yeah, yeah,
right? So they're using like
yeah, and they go
30 years ago.
Yes, the attorneys, exactly what you're saying, John. The attorneys can access the movie, and it's been recording the whole time. It's exactly right. It's the eye and the ear that have been filming you throughout your life. That there is a heavenly record of that, which can then be accessed. And that's a really interesting idea, that this is the way that it could be used. Our ancestors couldn't have imagined, the technology necessarily that we have today, but gosh, it really looked like it. You're right, John. In that movie, it looked like we've definitely gotten to it now. Except now, there'd be a time code running, and there'd be, but it's the same thing. We'd put it up on the screen and look at it on a higher definition screen, but it's the same thing still. So yeah, definitely, if you haven't seen the movie, go out and watch it. you should watch it every few years at least, just to think about whether you've taken some of these lessons to heart, because there is a really good lesson throughout and definitely at the end. And it's good. It's a very Jewish movie. And of course, for those who don't know, Albert Brooks's real last name is not Brooks. Anybody know what his last name is? His last name, well, his real last name is Einstein. So his real name is Albert Einstein. That's for real. That's his real name, Albert Einstein. Yeah. So his brother, unfortunately, just recently passed away. Super Dave, Bob Einstein. He actually, he went by Einstein, but that's his brother. That was his brother. Just passed away. But yeah, he's Albert Einstein. That's why he changed his name.
Was his brother Funkhauser?
Yeah, exactly. That was his brother.
No wonder Curb is so funny.
Funkhauser. For those who love Curb, which is another very Jewish show. I just watched an episode of it yesterday, the one with Kenny. I was watching the running of the bulls with Kenny was in that one, and Funkhauser's in that, and Funkhauser is actually he's very Jewish in it too. He gets in one of the episodes he starts going to synagogue and starts getting very religious. He starts wearing a yarmulke all the time. That's the Palestinian chicken episode, which we could also go back and watch. We'd laugh at it now, but it was very prescient as far as where we live right now, very relevant. But yeah, it's a yeah. There's some of those places that you find a lot of Jewish content in there. But yeah, this is the way we've been thinking about this for a long time, that there is a God that cares about our actions. And this is, we've talked about on our Tuesday classes. We had a long discussion about it yesterday. It was a big difference from the other religions and faiths at the time. Eventually, Christianity definitely took on this idea that there's a God who cares about whether we're good or bad. And Judaism was the first religion that actually said that it mattered. Judaism has a little different approach to it also, which is something we talk about at High Holidays, which is that we don't know which one of us is really the one who's going to tip the balance overall, that the scales are always in balance, right? The scales God's always looking at the scales, and if they go out of balance the wrong way, it's all over. And so we're never sure which one of us and which action we're going to do is going to tip the balance, whether or not it's just an individual scale or whether it's on the scales of humanity and of all creation. We actually believe that, and with the audacity that Judaism takes on this, which is that every one of us have the power to tip the scales a good way or a bad way. And that's what we, again, talk about, as we mentioned at High Holidays, the scales of and as I mentioned, the zodiac last week, the Libra scales that the rabbis played off of the constellation of the month of Tishrei, the time of scales, the time of judgment. So yeah, we actually say it doesn't just matter because somebody's going to heaven or hell, which is the obsession of some faiths,
I'll clean up.
that actually the whole world is on the balance. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah.
You're talking about tipping the get balance, humanity as a whole, or
Yeah.
tipping balances for the individual?
For both. I mean, we actually talk about both. We talk about whether the scales will be tipped for each one of us towards, how, whatever we understand our life, most of the time, the sages, when they talk about the individual, most of us are what we call Benoni. We're in between. We're not too far one way or too far the other way. We're kind of in the middle. A real tzaddik is weighed very high towards the good, and a rasha, a bad person, is very tipped towards the other way, which means that, again, it's not that someone's consigned or is doomed, but when somebody's scales are tipped too much one way or the other, one thing or the other is not going to usually really tip it. there are some weird stories in the Talmud where people say, hey, wait a second, that person was bad their whole life. Why did they get, why did they get a good judgment at the end? So there are some versions of that which are thought provoking. I'll say that. But for the most part, Judaism's always kind of said, look, by the time you get to the end of your life, when you're at the end, it's not like you're going to be able to do something that's going to fix the whole thing. It's not like you're going to be Scrooge and you get to the end of your life and all of a sudden, hey, I'm going to undo years and years of bad work in this world. But most of us aren't like that. I mean, most of us are not totally, evil or totally good. Most of us are in between, and a few bad decisions can really tip the balances in the wrong way. But we also understand, like, the whole world is on a balance. The whole world is being judged, because at High Holidays we kind of talk about the individual, but we also understand, like, well, wait a second, is the individual getting, it's this famous discussion we've had before, I've mentioned it High Holidays before, is this the birthday of humanity? Meaning, like, to some extent, is this the accounting day for a human being or one human being, or is it the whole universe that's being judged? And, is God looking at the totality of not just one person or one country, but the totality of God's creation? Is God going to weigh this out and say, you know what, I still don't have it right? And that's the flood story in the background. God's not going to destroy the world by flood, but God didn't say, I'm not going to rain fire down on it, or I'm not going to break it apart into a bunch of little pieces. And of course, again, are we going to do that now? Do we have the power to destroy the world? Well, we do. So are we going to destroy our own world? Are we going to, let loose, thermonuclear weapons or whatever? I mean, like, all these things are things that we understand now to be, these aren't myths. These aren't speculations. These aren't exercises in, faith. These are real things. That's why, of course, we're that much closer to midnight, according to the, I just saw at the end of the year this year, they moved us, we're 90 seconds away from doomsday. They moved us a few minutes or a few seconds, I don't remember, but
I thought they didn't change it this year. I thought they left it where it was.
No, I think they moved us to 90 seconds. Somebody can check me on that, but I think they told us we're 90 seconds from doomsday. I don't know.
That's who?
I don't know what we were last week, but at some point we were 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and now we're a minute and a half. The people that they consult on that, they didn't consult me, but the people that they consult told them that we're a minute and a half from doomsday. So again, this was Judah Hanasi, the guy who's the last voice of the Mishnah. So this chronologically would have been just about when it's all over. So now it goes back. Oh no, now we have one more. We have Rabban Gamliel, the son of Judah Hanasi, who again, part of the same dynasty, going all the way back to Hillel. He said, Rabban Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Judah Hanasi, said, excellent is the study of Torah when combined with a worldly occupation, for toil in both of them keeps sin out of one's mind. But the study of Torah, which is not combined with a worldly occupation, in the end comes to be neglected and becomes the cause of sin. And all who labor with the community should labor with them for the sake of heaven. For the merit of their forefathers sustains them, the community, and their forefathers' righteousness endures forever. And as for you, God in such case says, I credit you with a rich reward, as if you yourselves had actually accomplished it all. So this is a very famous phrase. There's a lot in here that is repeated in different ways. Some of it we've already seen, some of it we'll see in other places. But this one is really interesting because it says, you have to study Torah, but you also have to have a job. A worldly occupation, which is another way of saying, hey, Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, is really important, but you need to actually be working. Derech Eretz, you need to learn how to get by in the world. Derech Eretz means the path of the world, the way of the world. Now, some people obviously as we know, as we talked about, have devoted their whole lives to study and they're not working anymore. This is definitely not the way things are supposed to be. Some people translate the word derech eretz as not necessarily worldly occupation, but they have to be concerned with how they operate in the world, not necessarily making money or doing a business, but how they deal with people on a daily basis. They can't just study, they have to also, some people call derech eretz ethics or kind of, the way that we engage with other people. In any way, doesn't just have to be business. It's just the way derech eretz is kind of the way we treat others and the way that we comport ourselves in the world. Anyways, the translation though, regardless, means you can't just rely on Torah. You can't just be studying. You have to actually, do some other stuff. If it's work, well, that's interesting because it definitely seems to be something that it's not just a matter of being nice to people, because it actually takes work. It says when you do these things, you are to some extent are occupied. And well, they say idle hands are the devil's playground, but the assumption is you keep yourself busy with all these kinds of things, you're not going to do bad stuff. But it's also this kind of idea that if you just study, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be in good shape spiritually. There has to be some kind of other part of your life. There has to be another aspect to you that will keep you spiritually healthy, not just wealthy or take care of your family, but that actually will help you in life. Because it's not you're going to be wealthy, it's going to be because you will, the translation actually is, so you don't do bad stuff. So it leads to better behavior. It leads to doing things in the right way by balancing or by incorporating different aspects of your life. So if you just studied, it seems to imply that if you just studied, you'd be more prone to sin. So it's not like study alone can keep you away from sin. So it seems to me that there's a caution there about only study. So there's definitely an understanding here of what he's trying to teach us, that there needs to be a balance, that we've read about this too, the other thing from his ancestor that said, you got to study, but you also have to do action. You also have to do stuff. This is a similar kind of tone, balancing study with action and with deeds and with work. But there's also something interesting here that he adds that we really haven't seen yet, which is that we get merit. We get merit through our ancestors. And this is a concept that we call Zechut Avot. So here's the words right here. Zechut Avotam. Zechut is your merit, and Avot are your fathers, your ancestors, your parents. You can widely, in a more wider interpretation, your mothers and your fathers, your ancestors, the people who came before you. You actually get credit from them. And what's interesting, you derive merit from them. And we have this idea in Judaism that our ancestors, it's different than ancestor worship that we have in some faiths and some traditions in some parts of the world where people actually offer up prayers or, venerate their ancestors. There's an understanding that our ancestors have given us a certain amount of benefit that we get to stand upon. We talk about standing on the shoulders of those who came before. That we actually get to be risen. We rise up above where we should be because of them. And this is a very special idea because it's not that we venerate them. It's not like, it's not like we're praying to them, but we recognize that part of where we are, is because of those people who came before us. They've cleared the way for us, and they have given us the ability to be a little bit further ahead than they were. Now, that doesn't always happen. I know some people have situations where their parents didn't really help them, and sometimes they go back to their grandparents, and sometimes, or their great-grandparents, or sometimes they go from somewhere else. They derive their strength from another role model or somebody who helped give them, strength, and gave them, guidance that helped push them along, that gave them the ability and say, hey, listen, let me tell you what you need to do. You learn from my mistakes. And they just literally help them achieve something that they didn't do the work, but they were able to benefit from that person's experience or work, or, there are so many things, it's easy today for us to think about, this in terms of economic success, because the Jewish community, which has now in some cases lived in this country for 3 or 4 generations or 5 generations, we're finally starting to see, what it means when people have inherited wealth and are able to have a lot more resources passed on to them. I mean, we all know it. Most of our grandparents, great-grandparents came to this country with nothing. And so there was nothing, they didn't bring any economic value, economic resource to start this climb. And so many people in the Jewish community now have inherited wealth. It's multi-generational wealth, and it's given them a huge foundation. It's economic wealth. It's not the same, but think about the concept this way. Use that as an image for you, if you will, in that the merit of our ancestors, the good things that they have done, we actually get credit for it the same way that we have gotten money from those who came before. We've accumulated good deeds, and we're credited with that. It's the way God looks at it. I credit you with a rich reward as if you yourselves had actually accomplished it. You haven't, but they did. And we see this a lot in our prayers. When we say in the Amidah, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Yaakov, when we talk about God being the God of our ancestors, we're reminding God, and of course we're reminding ourselves, that those who came before us, our ancestors, established a way for us, cleared the path for us, so that we get a huge benefit from what they did. And we've always looked at it as if we have that ability to benefit from the people who came before. And we get credit for it. We actually, it's counted towards our merit, even though we didn't do anything. And God says that's okay. God's saying it's okay. Wherever it came from, if you benefit from it, if you're willing and you do the right thing and step on it, if you climb up to that next level, you've done it. You may not. You may decide to opt out. But if you decide to step up and follow the tradition and follow in the merits of those who came before, you get those merits. And so it's okay. Judaism doesn't say, well, you took advantage of your parents, you took advantage of your family, right? And that's what people do, of course, with people who've inherited money. They say, well, they didn't earn it. They didn't deserve it. They didn't do anything for it. They're spending their parents' and grandparents' money. Okay, fine. That's what happens financially to some people. Not everybody, but there are people who do that. But not everybody does it. What's interesting about what we're saying is that this is collateral, or this is something that we can decide that we're going to step up on, but only when we're stepping up and doing the right thing. So to some extent, if you're just spending the money, to use that analogy, if you're just spending the money of those who came before you, eventually you'll spend it. Eventually you'll go through it. But if your wealth, if your success is based on the merit of those who came before because of the good things they did, it only works if you decide to do other good things. If you're going to stand on that platform of the good deeds and somebody else then gets to stand on your platform, then you're on a platform of good deeds. Similarly, if you decide you don't want to spend every dollar that you got from the previous descent, your previous and your ancestor, your parents, your grandparents, if you decide I want to save that money and I want the next generation to have some of that money too, then that'll accumulate too financially. But the great thing about it from the standpoint of good deeds is it only works if you want it. It only works if you want to do good deeds. If you don't want to step on that podium, you don't have to. You're not going to step on it. And nobody cares. I mean, I care, but if you don't do it, you don't do it. If you don't step and if you don't put yourself on that platform, that's your choice. But if you
It's
do,
like the kids that could be sent to college and don't decide not to go.
yeah. I mean,
They don't take advantage of what they had offered.
somebody has exactly. Somebody's given that. Yeah, when you decide you want your family's commitment to education come to an end, you're absolutely right, Joyce. That happens also. People have a commitment to education, and then it ends in a generation.
Yes.
It's over. But what's great about this is if you want to be part of that, if you want to be another link in that chain, you can.
Mm-hmm.
And you get all the strength of that chain behind you. And it's okay. God doesn't begrudge you. Judaism as a community doesn't begrudge you. Nobody begrudges you.
Right.
Because you've inherited that zechut, that merit from your ancestors.
Rabbi, you can look at it, it just popped in my head during high holidays, right? We stand on the shoulders of those that did good deeds. And if we've done good deeds, we'll say, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. We try to get closer to God, but we're not standing on our own shoulders, right? On all the generations that did good deeds before us.
Yep. And if you want to stand on that pedestal, if you want to be part of that, that's there for you. And nobody says, hey, he didn't deserve it. Judaism saying it's okay. God says that's what I want, but you have to opt for that. It only works if you're going to be part of that. If you're going to be part of that, and then hopefully again create another generation of people that want to be a part of that want to have the merits of those who've come before, then it continues. And again, when we talk about what's our legacy, to some extent, the way I look at it is, the podium, am I going to be another level on that podium? Am I going to be putting myself on that podium? And then the next person can put my descendants, my students can put themselves up on that pedestal and be the next one. But I got everything below me. And then the next generation can go even higher. And that's what I think is so beautiful about this tradition, is that we're saying it's okay. Yeah, you're going to be up there because of everybody who came before you, and that's good. And the next generation can be even higher. What's the point? To get as high as we can, to essentially, as we say, to reach the Holy One, as John just said, to be as close to the Kadosh as we can. So that's the great thing is that nobody begrudges them. Unlike, the wealth part, people don't begrudge somebody for having those merits. God doesn't. And in the end, that's all that matters. Even if somebody was jealous of you for it,
Right.
then he says, you know what? You can be on this podium too. You can be on this podium and take your place, take your place. So, you either use the analogy of the chain, being another link in the chain, how far back that chain goes, or in this case, it's the podium getting higher and higher and higher, and it just keeps going higher. And that's the great thing is we stand on the shoulders of those who come before, and most importantly, we as a people want the next generation to do better. We're different in that way, and that we're looking backwards. We're not. We're looking forwards, and we're hoping that the next generation puts another link on that chain, or puts another level on that podium, and we want it to happen. We're not saying, well, we're moving in the wrong direction. Based on this from 2,000 years ago, everybody's saying, it's okay, stand on the shoulders and then let the next generation get up there on the shoulders, on your shoulders.
Right.
And that's what's so amazing is that that's what God wants us to do. And that's why I tell people that's the one thing that makes Judaism very different is that very few traditions very few people have looked at saying, you know what? I want my kids to do better than I did. And it's so obvious in the community. And again, I don't mean everybody. It's not like everybody has been like that, but for the most part, our community has always said, let the next generation do even better. We did good, but our kids can do even better. And that's one of the successes, the keys to the success, I believe, of Judaism is this belief in the future, this belief that we're going to do even better, that there's a generation, the next generation that can do even better. We can never give that up. So as much as we look back and as much as we treasure our ancestors, we also say and we value the past like nobody, obviously, but we also look to the future. So that's what we do. So we try to make sure that happens. The other part of this, it's not over actually. Rabban Gamliel, this later Rabban Gamliel, says also, be careful in your dealings with the ruling authorities, for they do not befriend a person except for their own needs. They seem like friends when it is to their own interest, but do not stand by a man in the hour of his distress. And this is what we talked about before with another one of the teachings, which is don't trust the authorities. There is definitely an understanding that, and it doesn't say Roman authorities, it doesn't say that. It says ruling authorities. Now, one could say that's any authority where, again, somebody has, there's a situation of power where somebody is liable to be used. And that is unfortunately just, a cautionary piece of advice, right? People, unfortunately will get what they want out of somebody and that sometimes means that, people get very disappointed. I can't tell you how many people I've counseled who have lost their jobs after decades of service. I just had a friend who's worked for the same company for 50 years, be essentially let go rather than, or not let go, but be treated like garbage rather than given a proper retirement. And you don't even know what to say. Like, a person's whole, life of again, 50 years being invested into a company and basically being told that they're not of value. That's a horrible situation for people to deal with. And the company was done with them, and it happens. So it's not, again, necessarily that they're evil. It's that they don't care about anything except their own needs. And again, be careful. That's what he says. Be careful. Doesn't say, we shouldn't have the government. There are other lines in Pirke Avot that say exactly that. Be very bad if we didn't have ruling authority. But understand, be careful, and be, never forget that you're expendable, that you're only as necessary as what they need you for. And again, sometimes it seems like they're your friends. Sometimes it seems like they like you. That's the words. Ke'ohavim, from the word ahava, that they like you, or that they need you, or that they even love you. But they do not stand by a man when he really needs them. So it is a caution. It's not like we can't have that. Just know that can happen. And it does happen. And don't take it personally to some extent. Because these are rules. These are things that happen. These have happened to many, many people. This is not the first time. Again, is that a level of comfort? No, but there should be at least a comfort in it's not you. Don't take it personally. It's not that you're not of value or that you in particular have no worth. And quite frankly, those people who made those decisions will one day be given the same evaluation as well, most likely, unless they leave on their own terms. But at some point, somebody looks at somebody and says, "You're of no value to me," and it's a very difficult thing for people to deal with because they take it personally. But if we remember that it's not personal, that it's not somebody necessarily doing it out of hatred of us, but just they're feeling like they don't need you anymore. Something to be aware of. It's something to be protected. Protect yourself. At least try to put up around that spiritual and psychological armor so that you're not going to be affected by it as much. It's going to affect you, but just know this is what happens. And it's been happening for thousands and thousands of years. If there's been any authority, this is what's happened. So, I guess it's caution too, if you think about it, to those who are given power, that they shouldn't treat people like that. But again, most people, even if they're very conscientious and sometimes you can't do anything about it. You know, my wife came in to me, I was on the phone yesterday, and she comes in after I'm on the phone. She says, "I just had to let somebody go." She goes, "I never liked that." I said, "Of course, who shouldn't like it? Nobody should like that. If you like that, there's something wrong with you. You never should have to say that. You know, never should want to say it." But they eliminated a position, they eliminated a account, and so the person didn't have a job anymore. But I'm sure at that moment they didn't really care, other than my wife had to tell them that they no longer have a position. It's a terrible thing to say. And again, if she hadn't been affected by that, I would have been worried about her and worried about me. If she didn't, if she hadn't, it did, for her it was a little bit easier because she wasn't firing somebody for poor performance. But it's still tough, and people are expendable. It's a sad thing to think about, especially for people who work in corporate America. So be careful. It's a warning. That's what it is. Zehirin. It's a warning. Be careful. Zohar. So, not done. He used to say, this is a great one, do his will, with a capital H, right? Do his will as though it were your will, so that he will do your will as though it were his. Set aside your will in the face of his will, so that he may set aside the will of others for the sake of your will. Let's just look at that before we get to the next part of Hillel. So this is all part of Rabbi Gamliel III. So he said, again, Aser retono kirtzonecha. Do his will as though it was your will, so that he will do your will as though it were his. So your will and God's will, if they're the same, God will do your will. It's a clever way of basically saying, if you're working on a higher power, towards a higher purpose, towards a godly purpose, it's God's purpose. It'll happen. God will make it happen. If you do it as it's your will, right? If you're doing what you really want to do, and it's not what God wants to do, who knows? Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work. But if you're doing what God wants you to do, what God wants to do, I should say, not what you want to do, but what God wants you to do and what God would do. When you're doing God's work in this world, God will help you in that. God will make it happen. And so what it's saying is, again, I mean, does that always happen? I don't know. But I will tell you that if what you're doing is God's will, you're not doing it for yourself. I'm not doing it for myself. Now, again, sometimes we delude ourselves into thinking we're not doing it to ourselves, for ourselves and for our own benefit. And obviously the rabbis would sometimes fall into that trap. And that's why it's a caution. That's why he's saying you need to do it like this. But if you're really doing God's will, then God will make it happen. God will, and so what you get out of that is a sense of satisfaction, the sense of fulfillment, because the things that you're doing that are God's will, they're the things you want to do. I want to do it. And so as I'm doing it, as we're doing it together, as I'm doing this job with God, I have a sense of satisfaction. And my
And you're teaching this class. My guess is we're getting pleasure, God's getting pleasure, and you're getting pleasure.
yeah, and that's why when I think about the things that I do in a more objective way, I come back to this phrase all the time.
Yes.
Is this my will or is this God's will? And again, it makes it easy because it's a great example. It's something I was actually thinking of as I'm reading it, was that's exactly what we're doing right now. That's what I'm doing right now. So here's the thing. I'll to embellish on what Joyce said. So if so I'm just going to use, because Joyce, you set it up perfectly. So here's an interesting one, and this is why it's a caution. So I'm just going to be honest with everybody, flat out, what this means, because even this, what we're doing right now, can be an exercise in ego. Because what happens is people say, oh, well, I want to teach a class where there's 300 people there, and my success is whether there's 300 people there. Why is that? Now, you could lie to yourself and say, it's because I want as many people to hear this message from the Torah and from the Mishnah and from God. I want more people to hear this, and therefore it's an expression of my desire to have as many people as possible to hear this. That's a lie, by the way. Just
you just put your ego into it if you did that.
Exactly. So it's so easy. It's so easy to do that. And it's so human to do it. And it's so, unfortunately, it shows you how even something that is really holy and really good can become an exercise in that. And it's one of the reasons why I don't like going to rabbinic conferences, because the rabbis all sit around going, how many people come to your services? How many people are in your synagogue? How many people do this? And it all becomes an exercise in ego. And I'm like, who cares? Like, if you're a rabbi at a big congregation, then a lot of people are going to come to your stuff, whether it's good or bad. It's not a reflection of, there were only 100 people when I started, and now there's 300. So it always becomes an exercise in this. And I fall into it, everybody falls into the exercise of the ego, because it's so easy and it's so hard for us to turn that off. I mean, look, was there a sense, folks, I'm only telling you this because I'm being 100% honest, and I want you to understand that you heard me do it. Because when I said, oh, look, there's already a dozen people, 10 people on, whatever, that was an exercise of my ego. First of all, if I really, and I've told people this before, and people know this, and Mike and Mary have been in classes when we've had 2 or 3 people. I do a class if there's 2 or 3 people. I'm committed to doing it, and I believe in it, and I will do it for myself, because we finished the Shammai saying last week that you have to make Torah your fixed job. It has to be a fixed practice. It has to be a discipline. So it has to be a discipline for me too, because otherwise I won't do it. Otherwise I'll get something else. I'll get involved in something else. Anyways, but I still fell into the ego of, oh, look, there's over a dozen people paying attention to this. Am I going to, after this is over, look to see how many people are watching this right now on Facebook? 100% I'm going to, because I can't exercise that from who I am. I mean, I try. I sometimes I like to say, and it's true. I forgot. I didn't look it up, but I might look it up later, because it is an exercise of ego. And at that moment that I care more about that than the fact that I did it myself, or that for whoever was here that we could study together, then I'm not doing God's will, I'm doing my will. And it's very easy to do that. And I say that because it's easy to do it in a way that is so simple and so connected to doing something so beautiful and so holy. So
Right.
constantly part of our existence as a human being. If we're honest about it, and I'm being honest about it, at least I can say, hey, look, call myself into account for it, and I recognize it, and I'm going to be truthful about it, and I'm going to be conscious of it, and be mindful of it. But I will tell you that when I think about that phrase, which, you know, this is one of my favorite lines in all of Pirke Avot, making my will God's will, and then my will, and then my will. But it's, you know, it's such a clever saying because it flips the language. But what
Right.
it really is it's making sure that what I'm doing is not for me. It's not for my aggrandizement. It's not for feeding my ego or feeding my income or anything else, but that it's about the holier purpose. It's about the reason that I really want to be here in this world. And that's what I'm doing. Then it doesn't become an act of the individual and of the ego and of the moment. So
Right. And that you would do it even if there were two people there brings it up to a higher level than an ego level.
well, there's people on this stream right now who know that. But look, you know, everybody.
Rabbi Mark, you are appreciated. You need
No,
to
no,
know.
thank you for saying that. I didn't say it for that, but I appreciate it. But I will tell you,
We appreciate you. We'll give you a couple likes tonight.
yes, thank you. But the point is that it's very easy to fall into that. And
It is.
even when you're doing something good, even when on the face of it, it's very obvious that we're doing something important, but even that can turn into an ego exercise. That's all I'm telling you. And so the separation between doing our will and God's will is really, really fine. And it is something that, like, that's my ego check. Is this my will or is this God's will? Is this really what God wanted me to do in this moment, or is this a pure action of the ego? And again, I'm not just being, it's a matter of being honest about it and saying, oh, that clearly was what you wanted to do. And when I fail in those ego exercises, it's just a reminder that, again, that's what you get. That's what you asked for. That's what you wanted. And again, there is this understanding that, you know, your success will be amplified by God. And
Yes.
at the end of the day, that's we want to feel a sense of success. But the sense of success should be an outgrowth of our serving a higher power and a higher purpose, rather than again just feeling good in the moment. And that's the ego check. So that's the ultimate ego check. Your will, God, versus mine.
Well,
So
that's if I look at my grief loss group.
yeah.
I give my all to it. I love doing it. And then I am curious how many people came this week.
Yep.
So
It is a,
your ego can get in there.
yep. That's another perfect example of it. And again, you know, and I'm proud of you, Joyce, for doing it, because again, I'm like, look how many people were, and I go, look, I know, I just look at it as, oh, look how many people came and were helped by this group. And so it becomes, yes, it becomes that, and it becomes that, but that issue. And again, Joyce will tell you, and anybody who's ever done anything like this will tell you, you know, you're all of a sudden, well, why aren't there as many people here this week? You know, is it because people didn't want to, you know, I'm not, people didn't need me, or, you know, so it feeds into that ego situation. And again, the problem that we have, and again, this is one of the problems about the rabbinate and teachers and professors and a lot of the people who go into these jobs need to have that. They have a they have a longing to have their ego stroked, and it's something that they feed off of. They actually need it. They need it for their own sense of self, because they for whatever reason they're wounded, and they're missing they missed the affirmations and the positive energy from a parent, or whatever the pathology is. The reality is that there are so many people who go into these jobs, including the rabbinate, who are just, are literally doing it clearly because they need to have their ego stroked. And it's really been a problem. It's a job that feeds into that. And I've seen, some tremendously, and again, it's obviously in a church too. There's a lot of ministers that have gotten caught for this, that it becomes literally disastrous because their ego has to be fed, and they get caught at some point. They'll get caught, and sometimes it's a disaster for their communities. Take down a lot of people with them when they get caught. But it's unfortunate that this job and this role actually feeds that, and it's unfortunate, and it's been one of the sick things that has happened in the Jewish community over the last 100 or so years. When we didn't have professional rabbis, there weren't people necessarily doing that because there was no job where they got to come up in front of a synagogue and get to perform. But for the people who do, or who needed that, it became a real problem because the community fed that. There was a whole cycle of unhealthy relationship there, and rabbis fed off of that, and the community fed off of it. And I like to tell people it was most egregious because it destroyed a lot of the Jewish community, because what it did is it infantilized the Jewish community. They had a rabbi who was their professional Jew. They would go to synagogue to see their professional Jew perform for them and tell them about these things, rather than empower them and give them the access to the text, or to help them know this stuff. And they loved it. The people loved it because they didn't have to do anything. They just got to feed this guy's ego. And I said guys, because back in those days, it was almost all men. And then on top of it, the rabbis loved it because they were sycophants who needed to have that energy from other people. And the relationship fed off of itself, and it created a situation in the Jewish community where we had generations of Jews who never knew what was in the Torah, because they went and saw, oh, listen to our rabbi who gave a great Devar Torah this week, and they never learned it. They never had a chance to think about it. And the rabbi sat there going, look how many people love my sermon. They love my sermon. They keep talking about my sermon. And it just caused this cycle of illiteracy in our community, and the rabbis got approval. So they paid back this approbation with a cycle of constantly dumbing down the community, and literally creating a situation where no one actually knew what the hell the guy was talking about until he started talking about it. So it blows my mind that that's what happened, but it's very easy for a cycle like that to be created. So we have to, obviously we have to break that cycle in the Jewish community, but anywhere where that happens, where people get infantilized because they have somebody who loves doing this for them, and then they don't have to do it, and then they don't know it, and that's a very dangerous cycle. So hopefully we're pulling ourselves out of it, but it partly happened because the system collapsed, and so we're hopefully gonna pull ourselves out. It's definitely happening. It's happening. It's happening for a full cycle of reasons, including the economy and how synagogues are going to reformat and how they're going to exist in the future. And my hope is that the Jewish community becomes more emboldened and becomes more empowered with the knowledge that's there. It's accessible. Anyone can go on Sefaria like we just did. All of these texts are accessible 24/7, every moment of every day. You don't have to get into a synagogue library like you used to and not even know where would you even go to read this. Anyone can read this stuff any time of the day.
Right.
The information is all there. And all I want to be is a conduit for giving people this information and for seeing this and being able to think about it. Go and think about it.
And you involve us. You don't just lecture to us and
I hope I hope this is explication and not what I think it means. And that and what I will try
how
to
I
do,
see it.
I'll try to make sure that people actually get to understand what the clear meaning is, because sometimes the translations are not good. This is back to Hillel now. So all of a sudden we went right from his great grandkids back to Hillel. And these are some sayings that he said. And this is not the end of Hillel. This is, I told you, we're going to come back to Hillel. And this is what we're going to finish with today. This is a very famous saying from Hillel, not as famous as "If I'm not for myself, who will be for me?" But it's another interesting one, and I think very powerful one. And unfortunately, it's not as well known, but it really should be really well known. It will be known to everybody today, and that is Hillel said, "Do not separate yourself from the community. Do not trust in yourself until the day of your death. Do not judge your fellow man until you've reached this place. Do not say something that cannot be understood, that in the end will be understood, and say not, when I will have leisure, I shall study. Perhaps you will not have that leisure, that leisure, I say leisure. But the point is, look at that saying that he just laid out, because Hillel starts with this really important idea that we have in Judaism, which is we don't separate ourselves from the community. We can't. Our community is part of who we are. And the Hebrew is al tifrosh min hatzibor. And I remember learning that as a kid, that this is one of the sayings that Hillel told us, that we don't separate ourselves from our community. Our community, it's got to be with us all the time. We have to know that we have a community we can walk into, and every place in the world will find a Jewish community that's our community. And that we are a people that have always been based on community, based on our relationships with our community. And so Al Tifrosh Min Hatzibor is something like that. You know, as a kid, I knew that there is no Jew outside of a community. There is no Jew outside of, the people around them. You can't be a Jew by yourself. It's always been drummed into me. It's not, you can't be a monk of Jew. There's no Jewish monk that sits in a cave, not near anybody else. That's not Judaism. This doesn't fit into Judaism. It doesn't fit. And this wonderful saying, don't trust in yourself until the day of your death. Now, that's definitely more of one of those, ones that we think about, what does our life mean? What is our legacy? But again, the way he lays this out, and again, this is not a threefold saying. There's several ideas here. But this one here, if this is the second one, again, do not trust in yourself until the day of your death. Don't have faith, or not, or say, I know everything I've done has been right. Because that type of attitude leads to the inability to grow and to change and to understand that maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I don't know everything. Maybe there's something I still need to tweak a little bit. And so he's telling you, until the day you die, don't say you got it all covered.
Right.
Be so sure. And that can apply in so many wonderful ways for, our own senses. We were talking about ego before, to have that sense of humility, to have that understanding that, like, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I don't know everything. Maybe I missed that. And maybe I'm missing something right now. Maybe there's some aspect of my life that I'm not attending to. This is something that is a very humbling and very powerful idea that even Hillel said, yeah, maybe I'm not so sure. And Hillel was a great guy, but he said, yeah, I can't be so sure. And that allows for our growth. That allows for us to be able to change. It allows us to say we made a mistake. It allows somebody to say, hey, I got to change that. I got to fix that. Because I'm not so sure. I'm not 100% sure. I hope, I think, but maybe I'm not doing it right. Sometimes we know flat out we're not. Sometimes we know really well we're not. We don't have it all together. But there are a lot of people that we look at and we go, oh, they must think that they all have it together. Well, Hillel tells you, if they're really, really on the right path, they're not so sure. They're not 100% sure. There's always that sense of maybe I'm missing something. And it's a great way to approach life. It's it's again, it's people who are so sure of themselves that are, wind up getting in a whole lot of trouble. And again, sometimes it's behavior, but sometimes it's also other things like, they're sitting around going, hey, I've made all these great financial decisions. I put all my money in blah, 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 blah. And it turns out, you probably shouldn't have done that. You probably should have been a little bit more skeptical. You maybe should have been looking at some other options. Maybe you should have diversified, right? Maybe you should have spread your stuff around. Maybe you shouldn't have been so sure that that was the only thing that you should have been a part of. And again, there's so many ways that happens to us. There's so many different ways that we look at our lives and go, I'm not 100% sure maybe in this case. Maybe I need to think about this. Maybe I need to understand that I think I'm okay, but I might not be. Not only is it okay to do that, we're supposed to do that. It's actually the way we're supposed to live, not to trust too much in that we're 100% there. It's not that we're supposed to doubt ourselves all the time, but there should be a little doubt.
Can I ask a question though?
Yeah.
But how do we know what's God's will?
Well, that's the part that his great-great-grandson said. He talked about trusting in yourself. So that's where he's saying, if I think I've made all the right decisions, if I'm trusting in myself, probably have made a mistake somewhere along the way. And I probably shouldn't be so sure that every step that I've taken has been the right one. It's a sense of humility. It doesn't mean like I'm a screw up. You don't look at yourself and go, hey, I'm a big idiot. But it's, you look at yourself and go, you know what? Before I think that I'm got everything together, maybe let me check that again. Maybe let me have a little bit of humility that maybe I didn't make every one of the decisions I made along the way. And again, there's that understanding that when the thing that we didn't think ever would go wrong goes wrong, then we said to ourselves, you know what? That could have happened. You know why? Because Hillel told me 2,000 years ago that stuff happens. He said that stuff happens. Now, the next line goes back to some of the other things that we've read before, but one that, has been said in many different ways, don't judge a man until you walk in his moccasins, which was supposedly, this Native American saying that people said, well, I don't know when that was said, but I know that this has been taught for 2,000 years, and it says essentially the same thing. Don't judge a man until you have been in his place.
Could I make a comment?
Please.
I believe emphatically that these two people are sitting here because there's a God. When we were teenagers, Esther was working at a summer camp for kids. That was her neighbor down her hall, her father, I think it was, or her uncle, put that camp together. One day toward the summer, my mother was going through a newspaper. I was a lower middle teenager, and she saw there was an ad looking for somebody to work in a summer camp, and they were looking for a teenager. And she said, gee, would you like to do that? Sure. And in the beginning of camp, guess who I ran into? She's right here. And we got together pretty powerfully. The next summer, however, my mother was the type of person, and I'm not saying I thought she was a terribly good person, to be very straightforward. She sent me to a different place to work in the summer, and that's not where Esther was. But the next summer, I said, no, there's only one place I'm going. I'm going to back Sherwood, where Esther is, although we saw her somewhat in between. And during that summer, we were still teenagers. We decided to make life together. And eventually we did.
Wow.
We're still here. And there's decades and decades and decades I'm talking about. And my belief has always been the way that worked out and the way it started, it had to be from God. It just happened that way. So with all your things saying, I couldn't agree this whole thing more.
Yeah.
Because I felt since I ran into this woman, there had to be a God. The way
Yeah.
it happened, it just had to be that. And
People, and that's why
saying now, it just,
that's what we call that person the Bashert, right? That's the person
yes,
we're destined to be with.
yes,
That's when
exactly.
people feel it the most.
Excuse me?
That's when people feel it the most. They feel the plan the most is when they can look back on a relationship and say that's a miracle.
Yes.
Well, the level of this and the way it happened and the way it got back to it got when we got together again, and that's in that year after skipping a year, that's when we got to one day get married.
Yeah.
You know, and it kind of worked that way because then I was a teenager and now I'm 81 and she's still here.
That's a great story. Thank you, guys. That is a great reminder of the way God works. And again, I would say that it's most obvious or most accessible to us when we think about people who've become our life partners. It's really amazing because we think about, how the miracles of how people meet and how that happens. It's one of the most amazing things. But again,
And how you met Tracy.
how again, that I think
How
It's
wonderful.
like a miracle.
how I met Tracy. Yeah,
I absolutely looked at it that way.
going to another country and
Yes.
think about those things. But look, I mean, the reality is that our whole lives, from the moment that we come into this world, people talk about how much we know about science and how improbable it was that we were ever going to be born. We
Yes.
understand that on a scientific level, on a cellular level, the odds for us to be here are it's so amazing that I mean, it's one of those things where you can deny that there's a higher power. You can deny that there's not, that there isn't a purpose to this, but the onus is on you to explain that to me, because I know, because science has told me, and rational thought has told me that my existence, that my ability to find somebody that will be with me for my life, who I met by accident, is so ridiculously improbable that how can I not? How can I not? I mean, your job to convince me otherwise, it's on you, because the vast evidence for where we are and how this is happening, it just doesn't make sense otherwise. So again, people can say it, but the onus is on you, because I don't see how it's possible. So yeah, this is this understanding, this overall understanding of being in the presence of God. But again, this living is a miracle. But this understanding, again, back to when he says, "Don't judge a person until you've been in their place." I think about that a lot, because what it does is, it doesn't say don't judge a person, because we understand that we are going to judge people, right? That we're going to judge people. It doesn't say don't judge people. We read before, judge people, when they come into your court. We read that text about,
You have to make
judge them guilty
judgments.
until they leave, until they are told, and then you judge them innocent. But here it says judge them, but remember them. Remember, you can't really judge them until you've understood how they got to make that decision. So if you don't take into consideration all of what happened to get them into that moment, into that point, then you're only seeing part of the picture, and you can't judge them. You can't make that assessment. And it's fair to say to somebody when they're telling you, well, this person's whatever, and then you say, well, wait a second, do you know how that person got to be in that position? Doesn't make an excuse. It doesn't say they're not held accountable for it, but it says it has bearing. It has something on that. So again, in the scheme of things, somebody does something right, does something wrong, we judge that person, we make an assessment, but part of that assessment is how they got to that place. How did they get to that place that they're standing in now? How did they get to that moment? And what decisions and what situations led up to that moment? And it is fair to ask that question. It's not only fair for us as a society to ask that question. Jewish tradition tells us we have to do that. We have to understand what people did in order to get to that moment. How did they get to that place? How did they reach that place? And that's what the phrase says. It says, how did they get Shetagia lemakomo? How did he get to that place? How does he get into that moment? Take that into consideration. And then it says, do not say something won't be understood, right? And this is a wonderful, also humbling experience, because there's things that we don't understand. And the rabbi said 2,000 years ago, there's things we don't understand. And guess what? They didn't understand about microbes. They didn't understand about, physics. They didn't fully understand that, the sun, was not going around our earth, but the other way around. They didn't fully understand that. And so they said, look, there's things we don't know. We have to be humble in our in our assessment of what knowledge we have right now. Don't ever say that it won't be known. There is information out there. That information is out there, which, by the way, leads us to a very important idea in Judaism. And for those who haven't seen Oppenheimer and haven't heard the discussions about it, understand that all those people, with the exception of like 4 of them, they were all Jewish. And why were they Jewish? Because this idea in Judaism has always been there, which is that the information is out there. It's our job to find that information. And that's why Judaism has never been antithetical to science, why it's never been antagonistic to science, because Judaism says there are questions that we don't have answers for yet, but we can have those answers. They can be found. And so it's our job to work on that. And it's okay for people to continue to work on trying to answer these things. And it's a good thing for people to answer them. It's not, well, that's God's knowledge and we should never look at that. No, Judaism says there's things out there, and don't shut it off. Don't shut off the ability for us to one day answer that, because shutting that off shuts down knowledge. It shuts down the ability for human progress. It shuts down the ability for human beings to expand and to grow. And so we say, don't say that. Don't ever say that we can't understand that. And the rabbis taught that to each other. They taught that to every generation as a warning. Don't say that. Say that we just don't know it yet. And this last part, which is a great way to end tonight, which is never say, I'll get around to Torah study. I'm telling them, preaching to the choir, as they say. Everybody here has made sure that they're here to study, because we don't know. Can't say I'll do it one day, because you don't know. Because remember what he said, right? Don't be so sure. My friends, part of that is surety, and believe me, I've thought about it a lot, as I've told some of you, thought about it a lot in the last 5 or 6 years, 7 years since I've lost my parents. I never say, I'm going to live to be 80. I'm going to live to be 90. I'm going to live to, but I never know. You never know. And not being sure of yourself to the day of your death, right? Not being so sure, not saying, hey, maybe I'll get around to this stuff. No, we're put on this world, as we said before, to study. We're put on this world to explore. We're put on this world to be surrounded by Torah. And we don't say, well, I'll get around to it. So we never know. Perhaps you will not have the leisure. Now, perhaps you won't have it because you'll never have to stop working. But it's also a possibility that you may get that final summons and just didn't get around to it. I meant to, but when we get to heaven, to go back to what John said, if heaven's anything like Albert Einstein, Albert Brooks imagined, that's our shot here. We got a shot here to do what we can in this existence. And if we didn't do it, can't go to the heavenly court. Well, you just didn't get around to it. They said, you had your chance. You didn't do it. You didn't take that next step. So how we tied it all together. You see, we tied everything together, John. We tied Albert Brooks, Albert Einstein, everything together was all part of today, all part of Torah. And definitely given us some stuff to think about, to meditate on, to take any of these things. You see, we read 4 verses of this chapter today, and
Wow.
we read, a couple of verses of the previous one, but you can see there's so much in there to think about. There's so many ideas in here that we can take apart and think about as guides for our lives, for the way we talk to people, for the ways we treat others, but also the way we think about our lives, the way we order our lives and organize our lives and kind of assemble, our plan. What this is all taken into consideration is that we have to have some mindfulness, right? We have to have some thought about this. We can't just say, "Yeah, it's going to happen. I'll wake up tomorrow, whatever happens, happens." You have to have some mindfulness. You have to have some consciousness about the way we live our life. We have to think, hey, these things matter. These things matter to the world, and they also matter to me. I'm going to live a better life because I thought about this. I've actually thought about, hey, what's important here? What do I have to do here? When I treat these people like this, it actually is, it actually matters. And
Yes.
what's really important here is, as we said before, we're so lucky because we have these scholars, we have these sages, we have our parents, we have the people who've given us a way to step on and step up another level, because that's what God wants. And God doesn't say you cheated. God said, hey, that's your merit. It's yours. It's theirs. It's there for you. Step up on it. But you got to be there. I mean, it only matters if you step on it and stay up there. So
I think this class is a blessing to all
Thank
of
you.
us.
thank you,
Thank
Joyce.
you.
Thank
Thank you. It is a
thank you.
blessing.
And thank you, all of you, for being here.
Yes, thank
Uh,
you for doing this.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And
Bless you.
Thanks
Thanks,
for
Rabbi.
being a part of our community. Remember, don't separate from the community. So we'll see you either on Tuesday morning or next Wednesday. And again, we've got a very special Shabbat broadcast coming up this week. Even if you're not here, we don't have a live service this week, but we have a very special Shabbat with Saul and Alana Kay, who are musicians from up north. And Saul and Alana have written some beautiful melodies. Actually, Rick and Addie have sung some of Alana's melodies. You'll hear her, the composer, singing those songs herself. So that's Saul and Alana are husband and wife, a young couple up in the Peninsula Synagogue up there. And it's going to be this Friday. You'll see the debut of those songs, and it'll be good. So I'm so glad you could all be here. And stay healthy, everybody. Stay strong, and we'll see you. If not before, we'll see you next Wednesday.
Thank
Good
you
night.
very much.
Thank you.
very much.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
Thanks,
Good night.
Rabbi.
Good night. Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.